Disclaimer warning. This is for a project for school about Jane Austen's novels. For any of my subscribers that are watching, if you do not like Jane Austen, please do not watch this video. For the rest of you guys that do like Jane Austen, I want to learn about Jane Austen, just stick around and enjoy this video. Thank you. And let's get started. To kick off, who was Jane Austen? Miss Jane Austen was born on December 16, 1775, in the village of Stevington near Basingstoke, England. To get a perspective, here's a shot of the location and where she lives, compared to the rest of England. Her father was a clergyman who went by the name Reverend Austen, and her mother, before married, was from a minor gentry who grew up in the upper middle class. Sorry, I'm not making sense. Let's just say her parents had money. Jane has 7 other siblings, 6 brothers and 1 older sister, and was the second youngest. The names are as followed: James Austen, George Austen, Edward Austen, Henry Thomas Austen, Francis William Austen, Charles John Austen, and Cassandra Elizabeth Austen, who was never married like Jane. Jane enjoyed dancing and attended fancy balls around her neighborhood. She began her writing in order to keep her family entertained. Her earliest known works, known as juveniles, consisted of stories that she created using her own characters and family member names. Her family advocated reading out loud and were her biggest readers. As quoted by Lord David Cecil, "Family dominated by the values of the middle class." From this quote, this became a recurring theme throughout her novels. After the death of her father, Jane and her mom and sister moved to Southampton, where her brother Frank and his wife lived. Her favorite brother was Henry, who she visited quite often in Southampton. On July 1809, Edward Austen gave his mother and sisters a permanent home on his Shotton estate, since the old land, which is now the Jane Austen Museum. In that home, she wrote her early works, such as Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, who were both published in 1811 and 1813. Also in that home, she produced actual content such as Mansfield Park, which was published in 1814, Emma, published in 1816, and Persuasion, which was published along with her first major work, Northanger Abbey, in 1818. The majority of her published works didn't sign her real name, and she was just known as Be a Lady. Interesting, huh? You wouldn't think that someone who wrote stories would have an intriguing name. Unfortunately, Austen died of Addison disease and tubercular disease of the kidneys. She couldn't walk far and used a donkey carriage as her main transportation when she was sick. When she died, she lied in her sister's arms during bed rest. She is now located at Winchester Cathedral Cemetery. Now, let's talk about her novels and her earliest works. Austen had a high interest in prose fiction, which eventually became part of her writing. These prose fictions are centralized around heroism, quote unquote, and connections between sentimentalism and other kinds of social and political transgressions. Her first major novel, Northanger Abbey, resembled her earliest works of juveniles. This story really makes connections with the readers who love Gothic romances. The story sets in the dark Gothic environment of a girl named Catherine Morland who just wants to live her life more exciting. Do we all? She gets into quite some mischiefs along the way. This story can be described as a more political world from the ones who wanted a voice, and thus shared with the ones who could afford necessities. Northanger Abbey's characters and events were really similar to Jane's life experiences. In the story, Catherine moves into Bath, which is a place in England, for a while, and a guy named Henry, a recurring name in Austen's works, Tinley, which I earlier mentioned that Jane got along with her brother, Henry the most. Her second published novel, Sense and Sensibility, contrasted between two sisters, Marianne and Eleanor. Marianne represents sensibility, the cult of love regardless of class, which was seen as a major source of transgression. And Eleanor is the sense, but not fully aware of being disappointing at times. The story brought up relevant issues during the post-revolutionary search for reform, with property issues, patronage, and gender in British society. The femininity from Eleanor began womanhood, and the eras that were developed through her sister Marianne was clearly expressing sex sensibility. The novel was the first of Austen's works that were published and revised a second time after publishing. Shortly after Sense and Sensibility came Austen's most popular novel, Pride and Prejudice. The story portrays the ups and downs of the interesting relationship between her main protagonist, Elizabeth Bennet, and Mr. Darcy. Jane Austen describes her main protagonist as delightful in a letter that she wrote. The title makes references to a variety of things, including how Elizabeth and Darcy view each other. Entailment, limit of inheritance, was criticized sharply from feminists, which include Wollstonecraft by a woman's position in the marriage market. If a woman doesn't get married in a genteel society, then she's almost worthless, which is a shame. After Pride and Prejudice was published, came Mansfield Park. It was first of her writings not been revised before the 1800s. The main character, Fanny Price, lives in Mansfield Park with her rich uncle and aunt, but her cousin Edward helps her go through her family troubles mentally. The family's morals were tested in various ways, but Fanny's state either becomes worse or better. The ideas in the story used to connect the rural English society that is described in the story and the outside world. Austen shows slightly about the slave trade and slavery in her books, even though there were talk about them in her characters. Following Mansfield Park in 1815 came another novel, Emma. The main character, Emma Woodhouse, is a matchmaker for her clients that are seeking marriage. She's described as a charming and clever, but tends to be conflicted with her own emotions. Emma takes place in Highbury in a year's time. Like previous novels, Emma represents heroines in novels, particularly who don't always at how a woman should be at that time. Austen denied during that time that social reform needs to be implemented on the evil behavior of spoiled characters. In other words, characters in the stories need a particular backbone. Finally came Austen's last published novel, and shortest out of her works, Persuasion. The heroine is a much older character named Anne Elliot. Persuasion is the only novel that's explicitly a certain date, between 1814 and 1815. Anne as a character is described as too good for Jane. Jane's connections with Anne is deeply obvious because Anne was a very relatable character. 8 years prior to the story, Anne is persuaded to split up with her fiancé, Captain Wentworth. Many characters were in the Navy, which is contrasted to Anne's own family. Persuasion was the most romantic of her novels because it gave the most curiosity about Austen's own affairs, but still has plenty of Austen irony, there's a lot of irony. Not only there was more narrative irony, but for more social usefulness in marriage. were lost on Austen's characters because how society viewed femininity in social persuasion. Interesting. She was so ahead of her time. Oh my god. Austen made a significant legacy in her works throughout her time in history. After World War II, far after her death, Austen's works were interpreted in the new views of social issues, like feminism, anti-imperialism, and class conflicts. Austen was modeled for the popular novel known as the Regency Romance. Austen wasn't fully accepted as a romantic author, but she was the only novelist before Charles Dickens who still has a growing reading fan base, which many novelists at her time didn't achieve greatly, and is very popular to literary culture, which many of her works have spin-offs, movie adaptations like Clueless and Rejecting Jane. There are even cookies made in her honor called Jenny Egg cookies. Here are some resources that were used in this video, and I hope that you guys learned a lot more about Jane Austen and her novels, and how she changed a lot in the feminism movement during the post-revolution and towards modernism.